In this video, I'm going to talk to you about the dynamics used in Bach's Brandenburg Concerto No. 5. Now, there's a common misconception among music students that music from the Baroque era had no dynamics. And that just isn't true. It's quite clear to hear any piece of music from the Baroque era, you'll hear loud sections and quieter sections. What is true, however, is that there would be a much narrower dynamic range. And as we go through history, moving through to the classical, romantic, and into more modern times, we get a wider and wider dynamic range. And this is true for a number of reasons. Firstly, the instruments that were around at the time were not as developed as they are today. And so they weren't often able to play as loudly as modern day instruments. So because of that, you didn't have as much dynamic range. You could get instruments playing quietly, but to get them to play loudly was more difficult. And so you had a narrower dynamic range. Now, the harpsichord is a good example of an instrument in Baroque times that had not much of a dynamic range at all. In fact, we're used to pianos nowadays where you can play loud and quiet very effectively just by changing how hard you play from very quiet to very loud, okay? So you couldn't do that with the harpsichord, and because of that, you didn't get any real dynamic range or dynamic contrast with the harpsichord. But this isn't true of other instruments. You've got instruments like the violin, the flute, double bass. All of these string instruments, you're able to play quite a wide range. As we move into later times, though, these instruments would be developed and they're able to play much louder. So a modern-day violin is much louder than a Baroque violin. Another reason is the size of the ensembles. Orchestras in the Baroque era were much smaller than later orchestras, and so because of that, the more instruments you have, obviously the louder you're able to play. So again, music would be quieter and have a narrower dynamic range. Composers from the Baroque era tended to use dynamic markings quite sparingly. So if you look at the score of a Baroque piece, you'll find only very few dynamic markings in it. Now, that does not mean that there isn't a range of dynamics used. And what they'll use, instead of a dynamic marking, they will use what's called terraced dynamics. Terraced dynamics is where the volume of the music is related to how many instruments are playing. So if a composer wants to make a louder section, then rather than telling the individual instruments to play louder, he will just introduce more instruments. So the more instruments that are playing, the louder it will be. So a quieter section of music, there will just be a few instruments, and then to increase the dynamic, the volume, they will introduce more and more instruments to make it louder. Now, Bach's Brandenburg Concerto No. 5 is typical of music from the Baroque era in terms of the dynamics. We don't find many dynamic markings written on the score. Instead, we get what's called terraced dynamics, which I've already said, is where if he wants it louder, he'll introduce more instruments, and the quieter sections will have fewer instruments. There are dynamic markings in the score, and we find these mostly in the B section in the middle of the piece. So let's have a listen to the piece now.
Thank you.